For the past few years, the world has heard about America's involvement with UFOs, and how even today, the United States is studying the phenomena to finally figure out what is haunting U.S. military aviators. But the U.S. is not alone in being confronted by unidentified flying objects. Its neighbor to the north, Canada, has encountered them for decades. And although the Black Vault has received a small sampling of those reports in the past from the Canadian government, my guest today has now taken it to a whole new level.
When something's moving faster than any fighter jet they've ever seen, and then it makes a right angle turn. Like, what is that?
Daniel Otis, a Toronto-based journalist who has written for more than 24 publications over the past decade, has accessed more than 20 years of Canadian UFO encounters and released them into the public domain for the first time ever. Daniel is about to step into the vault to break down the most important discoveries. Stay tuned. You're about to journey inside the Black Vault. That's right, everybody. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast or your live stream of choice. I'm your host, John Greenwald Jr., owner and founder and creator of theblackvault.com. In fact, you're looking at the whole team. I do everything over here, so forgive me if I don't get videos up as much as I want, but I'm excited about today's show. I am inviting, let me get him in here, Canadian journalist Daniel Otis, who just published a great article that has dissected 20 years of UFO reports from Canada. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I know you've done some interviews already about this, but taking some time to share it with my audience.
Hey, John, thanks so much for having me. I'm a fan of the show, and it's an honor to be on.
Well, it's an honor to have you here, and my kudos to you. You have been covering the UFO topic. You're obviously an accomplished journalist. You've done extensive work over the last decade. You've been covering the UFO topic, and correct me if I'm wrong, from April of 2020 to date? Or 2021. Now I'm messing up the year. Was it 2020 or 2021?
From April 2021 was when my first story on the subject was published, and I guess my first Canadian FOIA request went out in February of 2021.
2021. COVID has messed up my brain. So everything just kind of mashes together. So 2020, 2021, I see as the same year. Regardless, though, a long enough time to really dive into the topic. You've done some excellent work already. And I think this is arguably your best work and triumph at this point, because you've brought out 20 years worth of UAP reports from the Canadian government. And let's just kind of start there. I mean, what exactly was the headline that you just put out there through Vice, and what exactly did you find?
Yeah, so through Canada's Freedom of Information System, which we call, they're called access to information requests here, I was able to obtain 20 years of UFO reports that were filed with Transport Canada. Transport Canada is a federal government department, similar to, I guess, the Department of Transportation in the United States, and they basically regulate aviation. As part of their operations, they maintain something called KDORS, which is an online aviation incident database where incidents, big and small, get entered. A bird hits a plane, mechanical failure, and drunken unruly passengers, and, so-called UFO sightings get factored into that. So what I wanted to do, there are some public-facing reports from Transport Canada, but what I wanted to do was try to get more of the source data. Whenever these reports come in, the first point of contact are air traffic controllers, if it's an aviation report. And in Canada, all air traffic control is operated by a private company called NAV Canada. I believe in the United States, that's all fulfilled by the FAA, which is a federal administration. It's not a private company. So you can't actually, write a FOIA request to NAV Canada itself. But what I was trying to do was to target their communications and the reports that they were sending to Transport Canada about these aviation incidents. In addition to that, by filing these requests, we also got reports in from military personnel, police officers, a lot of civilians, and the release totaled about almost 300 pages, 290 pages to be exact. It came in through two separate information requests, and there's about 500 reports in there. Some of them, are drone sightings, balloon sightings, etc. But then there's a whole bunch that are, weird, unusual lights and objects behaving sometimes in odd ways, reported by, for the most part, professional airline pilots.
So with your coverage before and your time getting into the UFO phenomena, I use plural because I think there's multiple facets to this. Were you surprised at what you got? Were you expecting it, or were you just completely surprised?
I think I was expecting it because I had found many of the reports contained in the release I had found by looking through Transport Canada's public-facing aviation incident database. But there were reports that came in that I'd never seen before. Probably the single longest report in the release, it's about 4 pages long, and it details a pair of civilians seeing something over the Atlantic Ocean, reporting that, and then Canadian Air Force officials checking NORAD radar and, picking up something at, the exact time and location these people were calling it in. So, there were reports like that were new to me, but I think overall it was expected. I think what wasn't expected was how much of it was retained. Back about a year ago was the first time I filed requests for this information, and Transport Canada got back to me and said that those records weren't unavailable. Go try defense. So for me, it was just a matter of doing a little more homework and asking the questions in different ways and targeting more specific departments. In this case, I targeted the team that's responsible for putting together the online aviation database that I mentioned. And in addition to that, I also targeted the Aviation Operations Center at Transport Canada. So they're the sort of frontline aviation emergency staff. And that's where from them, that's where, some of the reports I'd never seen before came in, because that particular department was also getting communications instructions for reporting vital intelligence sightings or service reports. That department in Transport Canada was getting these UFO reports right from the Canadian military. Things with the Air Force emblems, things like that. So a lot of that was new to me. So it was a mixed bag, to answer your question. Some things, for the most part, it was expected, but there were a few surprises in there for me as well.
One thing I didn't point out yet, but I want to point out, is that you're not a quote-unquote UFO journalist. You're a journalist who covers all sorts of topics. UFOs just happens to be something you've covered quite a few times now. But with all that experience covering all the things that you have, going to when they told you the material was unavailable, did you feel are you kind of hinting that the Canadian government was covering this up or attempting to shield you from the truth, or was it just a simple you needed to learn the ropes of where things were?
I think it was the latter. Transport Canada as a whole tends to be very dismissive of the subject. In their statements to me, they're just very dismissive about any of this. But I think it was, just not asking the right question in the right way. An important lesson in journalism is don't take no for an answer, and don't be afraid of asking the same question again and again and again, because every time you ask it, you might get a different answer. And I think the same holds very true for when you're operating in the freedom of information world. I think you can attest to that. You can put 2 differently worded requests out there and different things can come back.
Absolutely. And it's a good mindset to have. So my sincere compliments, because a lot of times people will hear that no, turn around, and then just go, okay, thanks, and then just move on. And so kudos for not doing that. So if I can, before we dive into the documents, when you first, I want to take you back a little bit now before this, when you first started covering the UFO topic, Has your mind changed at all on the topic?
That's kind of a loaded question, John.
Yeah. That's what I'm about here at Inside the Black Vault.
I think, if anything, I'm just more open-minded than ever. I think, as you said, referring to this in the plural is probably necessary. There's, 1,000 people seeing 1,000 different things, very likely. But I think when I first dove into it, I was finding some, unusual contemporary reports. But for me, when I started looking back into the historical archives of Canada, and looking at reports from the 50s and 60s, that's when something really clicked for me, that we might, at least certain reports might be dealing with something that, science hasn't explained yet. For example, in an earlier story I did, I was documenting 70 years worth of, UFO sightings by Canadian military personnel and at Canadian military bases. One of those bases, CFB North Bay, which is in Ontario, the province I'm in, they had, I found reports from both 2007 and from 1952. And the one from 55 years earlier was genuinely the more unusual of the one. It involved something moving in a kind of erratic way. And, these were both cases with multiple witnesses, et cetera. And I think for me, it was seeing that kind of historical continuity by delving further in time with my research, that it kind of really opened my mind up to possibilities of what people could be seeing.
You said, and I think it was attributed to Transport Canada, that they're pretty dismissive. It was Transport Canada you were talking about, right?
Yeah, sure.
That they're pretty dismissive of the UFO topic. Is the Canadian government, and then equally the Department of National Defense, are they all dismissive, do you feel, or do you feel that some are more open to the phenomena than others?
I would say our Department of Defense isn't dismissive at all. In their statements to me, they acknowledge that sightings like this occur that are that are unexplained objects, phenomena, et cetera. They acknowledge the reality of that, but in their eyes, it's not a defense issue. So that's why, in Canada, there are pretty robust mechanisms for how these things are documented, but nothing is really done with those reports themselves once they come in from pilots and soldiers and police officers, et cetera. So I believe our Defense Department is not dismissive at all, and they don't see it as a defense and a national security issue. And frankly, I think that's a good stance for them to have, because the minute they start seeing this as a defense issue in Canada, then all the type of reports I'm able to pull suddenly become inaccessible from the FOIA process on national security grounds. So, there's a lot of people clamoring in Canada, our military needs to be investigating this just the way the US does. That's not something I want to see happen, because that means, the tap of data is just going to completely run dry. My hope is that if the Canadian governments does want to have a more active participation in the subject, that they would do so in, from a more scientific perspective.
If you juxtapose that position where it's not as you said, they don't feel it's a defense issue, juxtapose that with America, who says it absolutely is, and a potential threat, and they talk about that threat. Why do you think that there's that completely different stance between two neighboring countries about a phenomena that obviously is plaguing both sides, but one sees it as not a national security threat or defense issue? The other one now, after all these years, is finally saying, yes, it is. We have to figure this out, investigate it. They have task forces, groups and everything, and they do have that shroud of secrecy. Why do you think there's such a difference?
I just want to clarify one thing. Sure. Before I answer that question. In the statements to me, the Canadian military has said that they do not investigate these types of sightings outside the context of threats, credible threats, search and rescue operations, things of that nature. And there have been cases, for example, there was a case where somebody reported something going into the ocean and that they sent search and rescue helicopters to inspect. There have been cases where things have been detected on NORAD radar, and they have deployed Air Force assets to investigate. It's not like they're just dismissing anything that's remotely UFO. Like if they think there's something worth clinging on to, and that does fall within their purview, they will deploy assets. But you also have to understand the Canadian military and the U.S. military are two very, very different organizations. The Canada's military is relatively small. We don't invest a large amount of our GDP into the armed forces. Our armed forces are using, old equipment. Some of the CF-18 fighter jets that we're flying are, the same age, if not older than me. And those, those are our most contemporary, fighter jets. It's just a different kind of thing. It's a military that's operating on shoestring budgets. They don't have the money to sort of, pump, like, unlike the US, you can't just suddenly, come up with millions of dollars of black money and
billions out of thin air, just throw it out there.
It just doesn't work like that in Canada. The Canadian military, when it's deployed, it's usually limited deployments. There was a presence in Afghanistan, for example. We're deploying to Eastern Europe right now, but it's a small army that isn't trying to be on the cutting edge of technology the way the U.S. is. We're buying our technologies often from other countries when it comes to military hardware.
So
there is some domestic research and development, like, don't get me wrong, but it's just a different kind of machine.
I gotcha. And in your trek to unravel all of this, I assume Canada has some type of procedure to either document, or if there is a potential threat to go out, did you find those procedures? Are they pretty black and white?
So, that stuff they don't release to me, right? Because when it comes to, what the responses are to credible threats, then that sort of information can be withheld, on national security grounds from the Freedom of Information process. That being said, one can read between the lines. So, for example, there was a case that was covered, not in this story, my one previous, and it involved NORAD and the Canadian Air Force detecting something moving pretty quickly towards North America from the direction of Greenland. In that case, Air Force assets were deployed, CF-18 fighter jets. They weren't able to find anything, and a report I found later blamed it on faulty radar equipment in Labrador, which is Canada's North Atlantic coast. So, in that case, for example, it doesn't say CF-18s were deployed. It says that, there was some code word and then the code letters for the Air Force base that it was launched from. I think it was YBG Bagotville, the CFB Bagotville, which is an Air Force base in Quebec. And I just did the research. The only aircraft that are there that could be deployed that far were the CF-18 fighter jets, which, then I asked them, they could neither confirm or deny. All of this story is just meant to illustrate that when it comes to how they respond to credible threats, there's documents like that sort of spell it out, but you have to do a lot of digging in between the lines and, break down all the acronyms and code words to sort of get a sense. But, the full picture wasn't presented to me in those documents. There are still plenty of redactions, but I was able to glean enough to tell that story, which, they confirmed as being true, that all that happened that day.
Yeah, the acronyms are always fun to try and unravel. That's a puzzle and mystery all in itself. But away from then what could obviously be a defense threat of an incoming ICBM or something else in a situation like that, were there any other types of procedures that you were able to find with, let's say, a commercial pilot who's just flying around and sees something out of his, right side or something, and it's not necessarily like an incoming missile or something like that? Were there more commercial guidelines for them to report? Are those accessible?
100%, absolutely. And this is something I know personally about. These procedures are called service procedures. CIRVIS stands for Communications Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings.
Say that 3 times fast.
So this was first developed during the early part of the Cold War by the United States. I think I'm probably reading things that you've written because this is where I learned about the history.
It's all good. No, this is about you. Don't worry about it.
I first learned about these on the Black Vault. True story. Developed in the United States, quickly adopted by Canada as a Cold War era threat detecting mechanism. You see a missile, file a service report. You see something that looks like a foreign warship, file a service report. You see, quote, an unidentified flying object, file a service report. So this mechanism has been adapted by both the Canadian Air Force and NAV Canada, the private company that operates Canadian air traffic control. So these procedures, many decades later, are alive and well in Canada. And in both the Air Force and the civilian air traffic control iterations of these procedures, they both explicitly say that unidentified flying objects ought to be reported. And when those objects are reported, it starts a sort of flurry of notifications and reporting that involves the Canadian Air Force, as well as NORAD-affiliated squadrons within the Air Force. It also involves Transport Canada, the federal department, and NAV Canada. Sometimes there's police involvement. There's evidence of some of the details from these reports being forwarded to the U.S. Air Force, as well as NORAD headquarters in Colorado. So, there are mechanisms to document these things, but I'd say in 99% of the cases, there's little to no follow-up. Things get documented, they get shared around, and then they get put in drawers to collect dust.
Here in America, obviously you follow the news, but so this isn't new to you. But obviously politicians here are getting more interested in the last couple of years. They're, writing legislation. Just in the last couple of days there in Canada, it sounds like some politicians there are getting interested. Is that new? Or are you guys seeing the same thing, and have you seen that in the last couple of years?
In Canada, it's been crickets. I know you have folks like Senator Marco Rubio, who's been very outspoken on the issue and very candid, about the U.S. military dealing with genuine unknowns. It's been absolute silence in Canada. And on when is this airing? It would have been on Wednesday. On Wednesday, for the first time in decades, a Canadian member of parliament spoke publicly about unidentified aerial phenomena. He was in a committee meeting for the Natural Resources Committee in the House of Commons in Parliament. So this is like our Congress, right? This is like a congressional committee. And they were reviewing budgetary items, and it came up that a nuclear agency within the Canadian government was receiving money from the Department of Defense for security-related matters. So, Mr. Larry Maguire, who is a member of Parliament from Manitoba, after seeing this budget line, he brought up recent drone reports in Sweden over nuclear facilities. I think Sweden has been encountering some, conventional looking, perhaps military drones. He brought that up. And then he also brought up the new UAP office that was, embedded in the recent Defense Authorization Act in the United States. And he said, hey, we're putting money towards nuclear security. Have we had any reports of UAPs at our nuclear facilities? The Deputy Minister of Natural Resources said he wasn't aware. This is like the top bureaucrat in that department. And then Mr. Maguire continued to ask if they would be willing, if that information came to light, if they would be willing to share that with their U.S. counterparts, because I believe the language in the legislation put it as such that nuclear agencies should be reporting in to this new U.S. body. So he asked if the Canadians would be willing to share, as well as part of the international partnerships. All of that's to say,
But focusing, not to step on you, but focusing in on only nuclear installations, that's what they're talking about?
This is a natural resources committee. Canada is a huge supplier to the international market for uranium. We do a lot of uranium mining here. So this would be limited in scope to nuclear facilities. So he asked them questions about this, and they are obligated to provide a written response. And as I said, the questions were, just to put it more clearly, the questions were, One, are you aware of any, UAP or unknown drone incidents at Canadian nuclear facilities? And two, if you get that data, would you be willing to share that with the United States? So it's my understanding that the next steps of this is that this member of parliament will be presenting a letter explaining this within the month, I imagine. And that letter will necessitate a written response from Canada's Department of Natural Resources. I'm so sorry to go deep into the weeds.
No,
this is like super nitty-gritty procedural stuff for Canadian Parliament. But all of this is to say a current member of Canadian Parliament asked questions about UAPs and nuclear sites while on the job. And that just hasn't happened. That just hasn't happened.
That was kind of the point I wanted to stress too, is that's unprecedented for you guys up there.
Absolutely, yeah. But it was a legitimate question,
Yeah.
This is a person who has some interest in the subject, and he's on a committee that's dealing with allocating funding, to nuclear facilities for security. And that is certainly a legitimate question to ask if any UAP have been spotted at Canadian nuclear facilities.
I want to talk about something that is kind of a hot button issue when it comes to the UAP topic. And that has really, really shown itself here in the last week. For those who watch social media, on the Black Vault, I published a Freedom of Information Act response about what they had, what I believe anyway, labeled a UAP. And the reason I say that is it came up at a UAP-related request. It is actually stored online right now at the U.S. Navy online, what they call reading room, in a folder called UFOs or UFO docs. And then the subfolder is labeled UAP. So it's obviously connected. My question is, when you pull up this one particular incident, it had never been out before. There were photographs that I got. I published those. It is clearly a drone and a quadcopter type device, right? It's not an alien potential spaceship, nothing like that. It is a drone, but labeled as a UAP. The D word seems to upset some people, but it's definitely part of the conversation. I don't feel this phenomena is explained solely by drones. But as a journalist, can I ask you, what role does that D word, do drones play in this whole conversation? Because if you look at the clip from that you were just talking about, they're referencing drones. Do you get the impression that drones is kind of a secret way of saying, okay, it's something else? Or do you think that this is more about drones than some people want to believe?
I think there's a lot to do with drones in this. I mean, in these 290 pages of reports that I received from Transport Canada, there are objects that are clearly drones. Some are labeled as such. Some are ambiguous. A pilot says they saw a drone or a balloon. But there's definitely drone reports in there, just as there's definitely Starlink satellite reports. For now, it's quite common. Anyone who follows the UAP topic knows what a Starlink satellite train is, right? Like when you see a whole bunch of dots moving in a line, if you see a line of dots moving together in a straight line, that's what it probably is.
Yeah.
But back in 2019, pilots flying over Canada, back when this technology, was just starting to be launched, they had no idea what that was, and it wasn't common knowledge back then. So there's reports that are clearly that. There's reports that are clearly drones. There's reports describing unknowns that seem to be very drone-like in this release, and there's reports in there that don't seem drone-like at all. I think that's definitely part of it. Also, floating paper lanterns. I've been camping and heard someone screaming, in the campground about UFOs. There's UFOs over us, and it was a lantern. And had I not been there to sort of explain it, this person probably would have spent the rest of their life telling this phenomenal, UFO story. A lot of people are seeing a lot of different things, but at the same time, I feel like there are enough reports contained within the release to at least nourish me and make me still make me believe that some of these things are unexplained. Yes, drones play part of the picture, and you have to admit that. There's lots of people seeing different things, and not everybody knows what every type of drone looks like.
And I appreciate your perspective on that. I just wanted to ask simply because, and I've said it a million times on this channel, but my biggest haters never listen. I don't believe that's the explanation for all this, but it's very interesting to see the reaction when drones come up, and that's why I wanted to kind of get your perspective researching it for as long as you have, and especially coming from the Canadian angle, looking at how they treat it. So that being your answer as I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, but I would just want to add to that, I guess, perhaps even if some of the, more exotic sightings turned out to be drones with advanced propulsion technologies, I mean, even if that were the case, that would be significant. It would mean that somewhere on Earth, a group of people or a government has perhaps harnessed a new energy source and has created a new method of propulsion that could be, completely change humanity, perhaps make fossil fuels obsolete, etc. If that is earthly technology, I think that's still huge and has huge implications. And if it is earthly technology, shame on them for not changing the world and getting rid of all this fossil fuel.
Yeah, and that's an awesome perspective. I'm glad I asked you the question. And I want to ask you one part before we dive deeper into the documents themselves. Essentially the same question, but in the eyes of the Canadian government. Do you feel that the people that you have talked to, obviously not every call you do is on the record, but when you reach out to these agencies and maybe politicians, I'm not sure exactly, who everybody you've interviewed, do you get the feeling that they see this as, there may be some kind of earthly drone, whatever explanation to a percentage, but they feel that it's actually bigger? How would you answer that with what you view from the government side and potentially politicians if you've talked to them?
I guess my answer to that would be sort of twofold. There's no institutional acknowledgement of a mystery, right? The ODNI report that came out in June, was an official acknowledgement of a mystery to a certain extent, if anything. That hasn't happened in Canada, but there are individuals within government, within opposition, in parliament, in the bureaucracy. There are individuals who are interested and individuals who have open minds to the possibilities of what these sightings could represent. I can say that with certainty, but there's no institutional reflection of that.
This next question may involve some of the new documents you got, but out of everything you've seen thus far researching the topic, is there one thing that stands out to you that made you go, wow?
I think there's been a few reports. I think earlier I mentioned particularly some of the military reports I was pulling from Canadian bases in the 1950s and 60s, when you have multiple Air Force officers standing outside and then writing their own individual witness testimonies that all line up, and they're seeing things that are, just moving in ways that are hard for us to explain. It's 1952 and something's moving faster than any fighter jet they've ever seen, and then it makes a right angle turn. Like, what is that? I don't have the answer for that. So it's reports like those. Are there any single one? I don't know. For me, it's sort of been, as anyone who's really dives into the data and the documents knows that, a lot of times it's pretty sparse. Like, if you look at these 290 pages that we released, most of these reports are just a sentence or two, right? Like, they are, there's not a lot of description and there's not a lot of detail. But I think it's sort of, for me, it's been the cumulative effect, going from, just this past year, looking back in history, 70 years to the 1950s, seeing a degree of continuity. And, that's just genuinely impressed upon me that there's an unanswered mystery.
If we haven't covered it already, would you have an idea why they are so small and only a sentence or two?
I think it's particularly with the ones that are coming from pilots. It just has to do with the nature of it. They're flying, they radio into the tower, they say a sentence or two. The tower checks to see if they have traffic in the area. then the tower calls the Air Force to see if they're picking up anything on radar. And, that's it. But in terms of the actual dialogue that transpires between the pilot and the tower, that's what gets, recorded in these reports. And it's minimal. They're not having lengthy conversations on their airplane radios, unfortunately.
Years ago, I had Chris Rutkowski on the show. He's a great guy, great researcher, known him a long time. I want to bring him back. So I don't know the answer to this, but back then, the last time I talked to him, there was kind of a share. It seemed like there was a sharing of data that he and the private sector would get these reports and get them forwarded over from the Canadian government. Is that still going on? Do they share this data with the private sector?
Yeah, this is interesting. So Chris is a Winnipeg-based ufologist, very respected in the field. He's for the past 30 odd years, he's done an annual survey of Canadian UFO sightings that's encompassed something like 20,000 reports. It's quite an interesting body of research. And for about the past 20 years, Chris had a relationship with both Transport Canada and the Canadian Air Force, whereby when they were getting, some of these UFO reports from civilians as well as from, aviation professionals, that they were forwarding them to him. That relationship appears to have ended without notice this past year. I asked Chris about it, and he said, he thinks perhaps growing public interest and growing public scrutiny on the topic has perhaps made the government a little more cagey about sharing that information. But yeah, I mean, there's even Canadian Air Force and NORAD procedural documents that include Chris's name and contact details. In the release, the 290 pages that we released, there were several reports from an Air Force base in Quebec, Canada, and they included Chris's name and his fax number on the bottom of the reports as the intended recipient. So, there was pretty much for the past 20 years, obviously in an unofficial capacity, Chris was really the closest thing Canada had to a UFO office. So these reports were coming in. He was using the data for most of them in his annual survey, but the reports themselves were not being released. And, I asked Chris about that, and his explanation makes sense. He wasn't in a position to show, things like Air Force reports and, these intelligence reports that were coming in. Some of them contain private information. The copies I receive through access to information requests, the private information gets redacted, people's names and phone numbers for the most part. But he wasn't in a position to be putting this material out there. I believe a lot of the material that was in the release in my most recent story, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it was stuff he probably would have received over the years. I wouldn't be surprised. But the body of his work is impressive. I think he's had something of a mission to try and document and point form pretty much every UFO sighting that's made in Canada. It's quite an impressive volume of work.
Yeah, he's always struck me as a straight shooter, and that's why I've always respected him, because he's just kind of an actual investigator, while others, more speculate and so on. He just is kind of a straight shooter and goes for it. So I didn't know that about the potential breaking of that sharing of information. So I'm super.
Oh yeah.
intrigued.
Well, when I asked Transport Canada about it, they told me, this is how I told you before they were dismissive. They told me that they were giving reports to Chris as research for his fiction novels. That's the sort of stance they took, and they basically said that they've reevaluated their position and decided to stop that. But the Canadian military, in comments to me, have said that as far as they're concerned, they still go to Chris. I have the current procedures from Canadian NORAD headquarters and the Air Force Operational Command Center in Winnipeg, Manitoba. UFO service reports, CIRVIS, unidentified flying objects is the first thing on the list of examples. And then you go to the next page. I'll cover up his email address, but Mr. Chris Rutkowski, so they say.
So he's still on there.
They say this is still valid and this has not been altered. So he's still on there. I hope Chris keeps getting stuff. I hope he keeps sharing it with the world, because if they stop sending stuff to him, the only way to get this is through the access to information system. Now, it's not like they sent him everything over the years. There's been I mentioned some reports that had a more defense nexus, for example, something detected fast on NORAD radar, like things like that they weren't sending. But the aviation reports, the weird ones, civilian reports, stuff like that, he was getting a lot of it over the years.
My gut immediately went to and maybe I'm just conspiracy minded, that the DoD spearheaded this, the American Department of Defense, saying, hey, look, we need to squash this. If we're going to be sharing information, you can't be giving it to the private sector. Because here, I've with ample evidence at this point, have shown that whatever UAPs, whether they be connected to drones, and that drone report that I had brought up a little bit ago, was still redacted. One of the photos of what is clearly a quadcopter is redacted. So there's a lot of secrecy around all of this. So I just kind of go towards, it's the Americans again. They're getting into, they're classifying everything. Have you heard rumors of that? Is there potentially that sharing of information?
I've heard rumors of information being shared between Canada and the US to a certain extent, but not like I've heard rumors about, UAP information being shared. I found full-on evidence of UAP case data being shared with NORAD and American Air Force and American Air Force bases. Like there's reports that include, service reports that UAP sightings, and that information is being shared with the US, but that's being shared with NORAD as part of, an operational update. It's not being shared to the specific UFO people within the US defense apparatus, right? So, the language in the American legislation is that they want to be sharing data with international partners. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard rumors of that kind of thing happening with government, but I don't have anything in hand to show you and say, hey, Canada and the US are letting each other peek at their UFO reports. I can't prove that yet.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm curious to see, because, and it kind of gives me a new angle to approach, because, going back many years, and you likely have heard, I think you and I chatted on the phone about this, but when I had gone to NORAD with a FOIA, and this was many years ago before I knew that they weren't subject to FOIA, and then they did their whatever internal procedure, I forget what the number is, where they try and honor the spirit of the FOIA, but since they're under Canadian control, American law doesn't apply, but they have a records processing procedure that they follow. Long story short, they said they found no type of service reports, UFO, nothing. And when I called the Department of National Defense on the phone, the guy at that time who answered, who had no idea who I was or why I was calling, I asked him about this, and he had a stack of the UFO service reports on his desk. And I was always surprised at that, but it solidified how the American side of NORAD will lie about it, because when I got the DND to send them to me, NORAD letterhead was all over it, meaning NORAD's telling me from the American side, no, we don't collect that. And then the Canadian side said, here you go, and gave me a big stack of them. And it proved, in my opinion, a complete fabrication on the side of NORAD. So to go back to your point about the sharing, I would imagine that the American government would try and reach out and tell the Canadian side, all right, let's stop the private sector sharing. We can investigate these. So when it comes to sharing, the American government will share going this way, but I don't think they'll share going that way. And again, that's just speculation, but I'm fascinated to try and drill in to see if there's any communication between what was the task force, but now the AOI MSG and the Canadian government. But anyway, as I digress there.
But further to that release, I read your piece on that, and I think there's a twofold reason why that comes so easily. I think one, because Canada doesn't really see this as a defense or national security thing. They have no reason to sit on this stuff. But at the same time, while it seems to be a little bit easier to get data in Canada, we can't get comments on it. Like, you can get statements very clearly talking about unidentified objects, from Pentagon spokespeople. Like, that sort of openness doesn't happen here. But I think the other reason it worked for you as well is just the nature of how NORAD is constructed in Canada. Can we get a little nerdy on this? The Canadian yes. NORAD headquarters is called a Combined Air Operations Center. So it's a combined center that includes, search and rescue personnel, Air Force personnel, NORAD personnel, et cetera. And, there are U.S. U.S. military personnel stationed in Canada, the same way Canadians are stationed in, NORAD facilities in the U.S. But, the staffing of it, they're all Canadian Air Force. So through our access to information system, while NORAD itself may be immune from, access to information laws, the squadrons and the individuals who report into it in Canada are not, right? So if you're working on a NORAD, a NORAD affiliated unit, it's still a Canadian Air Force squadron at a Canadian Air Force base. And it just has, it reports into this combined air operations center. So it just the structure of how NORAD is here allows us to get information about our operations.
And see, that's what's nice, because this side of NORAD, the difference is it sounds like you have other, and correct me if I misheard that, but other avenues to access something, to where our side, the minute it even touches NORAD, they go, sorry, nothing applies and there's no way to get it. And so the way that was written, which was JANAP 146E, which was the joint Army, Navy, Air Force publication, the one that I believe you were referencing earlier, that applied to both Canada and America, the U.S. Air Force had their own specific internal regulation, or instruction is more accurate, called 10-206. And with them, the Air Force is absolutely subject to the FOIA. But those service reports went all the way to NORAD, and that was it. That was the only copy. You couldn't touch them. So according to them, they never took a single one under this 10-206, which I know is a complete fabrication. But regardless, it went there. So that's nice to hear that on your side there were other avenues to approach it, versus our side. The moment it got forwarded to NORAD, from our side, from the American FOIA, it was shut down. So anyway, just a
yeah. So for me, when I do requests to Canadian NORAD, the requests go to the units that are reporting into NORAD. We got to get something straight here. Service. I keep hearing people use so many different ways.
Yeah, I was trying to split the difference because you had said service. So service is how I was told many, many moons ago is the pronunciation.
I hear it service, and I've heard that being said from some Canadians. Service.
Yeah.
Should we stick to one?
Like the UFO phenomena, I believe there are multiple ways to say it, so we can go with that. To be honest with you, I don't know. I remember though when I first wrote about it many, many moons ago, I was told, forget what office I was talking to. It was Air Force Base, but they were saying it was service. And I remember actually asking, I was like, really? It's service? And they said, yeah. And I remember in an email too, a member of the Air Force had spelled it out phonetically, and they did like VEES, to just kind of say it. Again, they could have been wrong too. So I was trying to find the difference between service, and it didn't work.
It could be tomato, but if anyone out there who is writing that JANAP, whatever, in the 1950s, and you give us a call, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, if there's a proper pronunciation, I'd love to. And it's probably neither, so we're both wrong, and it's something, completely different. So
CIRV, service. Like, I'm trying to think. I have a 6-year-old who's learning how to read, and I wouldn't be able to explain to her why those I's all have different pronunciations.
It's so communication instructions for reporting vital intelligence sightings. I can't really figure out why they always said that. It just always stuck with me. So,
okay.
So what I want to do here now is just, if you want, dive a little bit deeper into your newest article. And again, my congratulations for you digging. I have so much respect for your work and you actually taking the time to do something original. You're not what I call copy and paste journalism. You are out there doing the work, digging in and getting things that no one else has. So I want to take that time, and I know my audience likely recognizes it as well. Thank you for doing that, because there's not a whole lot of people that do. So my way of saying thank you.
I appreciate that, and thank you for recognizing that. Listen, I was reading and researching and learning everything I could about this for a long time before I started writing about it. And it was really only when I was starting to pull in information through our FOIA system that I felt that I could have, a meaningful contribution to the conversation. That, that's when I started writing about the subject. When this Canadian data started coming in, and I saw that it wasn't appearing anywhere else, right? But thank you. It's been, I've been working as a journalist for about a decade. I've written for over 24 publications, and certainly this UAP beat that I've given myself over the past almost year has been one of the more exciting and fulfilling chapters in my journalism career.
Exciting is a good word for it. So, and but yeah, congratulations.
It takes a special kind to call sifting through, piles of papers exciting and fun, but I think you know what I mean.
Speaking of getting nerdy, that's my cup of tea. I love that. I will take a stack of documents any day. And speaking of a stack of documents, you had sent me, and we don't have to do this, but I can bring it up here. I think you said that these were some of the best of your newest batch. Do you want to go through any of them?
We can just flip through, this, if you were doing an interview about my story, and these are the documents. These are a sample of 10 reports out of, the hundreds that were contained in the 290 pages. This first one, I think I mentioned, earlier in this interview, I mentioned a case where two civilians both saw lights hovering over the Atlantic Ocean. They were in Nova Scotia, which is an Atlantic province here. They called in a search and rescue center located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The search and rescue center notified a NORAD-affiliated Canadian Air Force squadron. That squadron in particular is responsible for identifying all air traffic approaching North America. Once they got this report, they reviewed NORAD radar data, and they got hits. They got hits that correlated almost exactly to the time and location of the sighting. So the first couple pages here, this would be a copy of the report that the Air Force would have sent to Transport Canada. And what's unique about this one is there's a supplementary page right after these. And you don't really see this. Yeah, usually there's just like one or two lines of detail. But in this particular case, they gave us a little more detail because they, picked up something on radar. The last paragraph, it explains this is an area that has good low-level radar coverage. There's no explanation why there are only 3 points, all at exactly 12,800 feet, with no points leading up to or continuing. Basically, they picked up something that suddenly appeared at one location at just over 12,000 feet and sort of slowly moved around in the general vicinity and then disappeared. And here's the report. What did it?
And this particular, just so we I'm zooming out here so we can kind of see, I'm looking at a couple screens here to make sure my audience can see it too. But this particular form, safe to say, created by Transport Canada, or is this DND? Or who?
This would have been created by personnel at the 21 Aerospace Control and Warning Squadron, which is located at CFB North Bay in Ontario. It's part of the Canadian Air Defence Sector, which is a NORAD task group that deals with identifying air traffic. So what would have happened in this case was the search and rescue officials in Halifax would have notified this Air Force squadron, and then the Air Force squadron would have filled out this report, and then they faxed this report to Transport Canada. Does that make sense? It's a whole chain.
Yeah. No.
It could be a game of broken telephone, but usually in most of the reports contained in this release, the reports themselves come from air traffic controllers with the private company Nav Canada. They call the Air Force fills out a form and then faxes it to Transport Canada. But Nav Canada also communicates directly to Transport Canada, and those types of reports are contained in the release as well.
I know you briefly covered this in the beginning, but was your AIA request specifically for these types of reports, or like how, if I may ask, did you word it? All UFO related reports?
So the release, the 290 pages were from 2 requests. I asked for all, let's go with service this time. I asked for all service reports held by Transport Canada. The first time I asked them that question, they told me to go ask DND because they don't deal with this.
You probably pronounced it wrong.
Yeah, there you go. But I kept asking, and I asked more specifically. So these reports come from the Aviation Operations Department at Transport Canada. That's the first 104 pages. And then the next 186 pages come from the Transport Canada department that's responsible for creating public-facing aviation incident reports.
One other question. Where did I see? Oh, here it is. I always look, at least on the American side, I find it interesting on classification and original classification. What was it? What is it? So on and so forth. Do you see a lot of these, all of these, as unclassified like this one?
This one is, yeah. I think what's also interesting here, this was faxed to Transport Canada. The fax machine is alive and well in official Canadian institutions. You can see the fax numbers up at the top. Most of them, the reports contained in this release are unclassified reports. That being said, if you pick up my Vice contributor page, there's other stories I've written that were based on classified military reports. So there's reports like these are because these are usually coming from civilian groups like air traffic controllers. They're not classified, but there are incidents and other reports on other incidents, et cetera, involving things with secret classifications, et cetera. My previous story was dealt with a lot of secret classified stuff. It was particularly, I had targeted the logbook entries for that one particular Canadian Air Force squadron that receives the reports and then does the radar checks. So I wanted to see what the internal mechanisms are within that Air Force squadron when they receive these reports. And I was able to obtain daily logbook entries. I actually think I have some sitting on my desk right here. Yeah, they're basically highly classified secret, and it basically shows in real time the day-to-day operations of this unit. So that's. Yeah, I recommend if people like looking at Air Force documents and things like that, I recommend having a look at that story because there's some cool details in there.
When you say that they were, formally classified or secret, in that instance, is the Canadian government just blacking out a bunch of stuff and that's why you got it? Or are they actually declassifying it for you and you're seeing what was secret maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
It's hard to say. Unlike the United States, Canada redacts in white.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So when
the U.S. has adopted that over the last couple of decades too, sadly.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. That's unfortunate because although it's harsh on the eye and it kills all the ink in your printer, at least when something's redacted in gray or black, you know where that thing's redacted.
Sure.
But when it's in white, you have no idea if there had been data there or if something's been scrubbed off a page. Like it becomes really hard to determine what you're being told and what's not being told, especially in a log entry like this, because all the entries before a UFO sighting are blanked out, all of them after. So in this case, you can't really tell what the response was, but there's been other instances I found where you can see the response.
I talk about, obviously, the FOIA on this channel a lot, and one thing that I look for with FOIA documents is the citation of why something is either whited out, because they do white out, and you can kind of tell. Sometimes there's a black border around it or so on, but they put a citation there, what exemption authorizes them to redact it. Does Canada do the same? Do you have any indicator on
why? Yeah, absolutely. So in the letter, when they release the documents to you, it explains which part of the Access to Information Act they were employing to redact stuff. The most common one is, I believe it's 19A. I hope I'm not wrong. It has to do with personal information and privacy.
Yeah, gotcha.
Names, personal phone numbers. There's other, I've seen exemptions for national security, for, confidential third-party information is one they like to use sometimes. That one annoys me a little bit.
Yep.
But
As a journalist, I can see why.
Well, I'll give you an example of a case like that. We were looking through these. Actually, maybe we'll get to it when it involves one of the reports that's in here. Basically, I was able to determine the file name of air traffic control tower audio for one of these UFO reports. And they won't give it to me because they say it's confidential third-party information.
Is there a way to appeal that? Meaning,
don't worry, all the appeals are filed. I re-asked in different ways. I'm on it. I don't give up at the first no. It's, you have to be a little more tenacious than that, and right, you can't accept no for an answer. If I know something's out there, I'm gonna try it from every angle I can, and in this case, this is a tower audio with a pilot describing a UFO encounter. So that's pretty cool, and I'm gonna keep going after that one.
I love those types of finds that you look at a document and sometimes they're easily overlooked, but those file names, when I go after emails, you look for attachments. And even though my FOIA, for the most part, will always say all emails with certain keywords, including attachments, a lot of FOIA agencies won't do it. And so you look for it, and it kind of essentially tattles on them that there was an attachment in the email, but you don't see it. But now you have a file name, and you can file another FOIA request or appeal and say, hey, wait a minute, I asked for this and you didn't give it. But I love those little finds because I often liken this whole process to a tree branch, and your trunk is that first FOIA, and it just branches off into 5 million other, things. And I absolutely geek out over stuff like that. You had mentioned that maybe we'll get to it. Is it in this release? Did you want to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, we could just, so these past 3 pages you've gone through here, these are reports from NAV Canada. Again, NAV Canada is the private company that operates air traffic control. These are all aviation incident reports that NAV Canada air traffic controllers would have received. So the first one that you pulled up there involved, actually that one was from NAV Canada employees themselves. That was air traffic control staff in Alberta, saw a bright, very fast-moving object. There was a citizen one in here. I don't know which one you're on now. I think we're on different pages.
It looks like Winnipeg. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. And I actually have a question, this one, before I lose it.
Yeah.
And it may actually be in here. I just didn't see it. So in this particular instance, on the same point that you and I were chatting about, you have this NAV Canada report, and then it says that a service report was filed. Did you get those, or is that...
I have some of those, not all of them. I have pending requests for a lot of that kind of material. But that's kind of, when they say a report was filed, they're not really, that's when they're calling the Air Force. And that's a verbal report. And that verbal report turns into this with the emblem and then the forms that get filled out like you saw before.
Gotcha. With some chicken scratch writing on it. Gotcha. Okay. Here's another one. Risk of collision.
This one's interesting. Yeah. This one, I was a staff writer at the Toronto Star at the time, which is one of our biggest newspapers here in Canada. And I remember this happening because it made the news, but not on the UFO angle. This involved a flight from Ottawa, our capital, to Toronto, where I live, by Porter Airlines. It saw some sort of large donut-shaped object directly ahead in its flight path. It took an evasive maneuver, and when it took a sort of, dive to avoid this thing, 2 of the flight attendants got thrown into the cabin structure of the plane and got injuries. This is a unique report. It's longer than most, and it's specifically because the workplace injuries that these flight attendants got when one of them hit the wall, I believe, and one hit the ceiling. The injuries made it necessary to conduct a federal transportation safety probe. So while usually the reports are just a sentence or two, in this case, they dug a little deeper. That's why you see about a paragraph of material there, because this one comes from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. It's a bit of a unique one. It's one of the only ones I found that's had a little more fulsome investigation, and it's particularly because there was an injury.
So 5 to 8 feet in diameter, an upright donut or inner tube. Now, granted, I'm kind of seeing this for the first time. I know you just sent it over to me, so forgive me. Was it solved? Do we know what that thing is?
No, I tracked down the investigator, sent him some emails. Took a few emails before he replied, but he eventually did and said, no, it was never positively identified. One interesting thing about this case was, had they positively identified it as a drone, for example, they would have continued the investigation. There would have been an even more detailed investigation. So because in this case they couldn't figure out what it was, this is where the investigation ended, because there was nothing actionable. You know what I mean? There's no one to give a ticket to or to penalize, or a regulatory thing that needs to be changed because of the incident, right? So because they couldn't identify it, it meant they couldn't do anything actionable with this report. So it got left as a mystery forever and ever and ever.
I just love that all of the UFO type reports are now using food as descriptors, because I get some, like, we got donuts now, which in my opinion is much more scrumptious than a Tic Tac. But anyway, moving on. So here's this Transport Canada report.
Yeah. So these again. So here, this would be the information that's being sent from the private air traffic control company to Transport Canada, the federal department. So now we're seeing emails, and these are emails that are being used to create public-facing aviation incident reports.
And those are published online. Those are the ones that you can actually access.
It's called
online.
The system's called CADORS, but it's spelt differently than it sounds, just like our surveys.
A lot of that going around.
CADORS, and it stands for, I have it written in front of me.
Yeah, no, real fast. You can't look it up.
It stands for Civil Aviation Daily Occurrence Report System. This is a totally publicly accessible database. You can find a version of this report in there. So these get edited, changed. Usually they just get sort of shortened a little bit, even more, believe it or not. And then they get published online. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them.
And that kind of leads into my next question. Did you find evidence that everything really does go into the system, or do you feel that there is a separate other occurrence database that maybe have some more interesting cases?
I can say with certainty, again, and any of these sort of defense-related reports that have a defense nexus, or search and rescue, where there's something actionable that the military has participated in, that will not go into this system. This system is, the UFO reports that are in here are, for the most part, aviation related. You know, we're talking major Canadian airlines like Air Canada, WestJet. I believe there's a Delta case in there that's pretty recent. There's a bunch of different US airlines. There's international airlines, and they're just seeing things weird. This one here that you have on the page right now, this one was from July 2021. This involved a Canadian military transport plane on its way to evacuate vulnerable people out of Afghanistan, as well as a Dutch KLM flight from Boston to Amsterdam, if I recall correctly. They're flying parallel, sort of over the North Atlantic, and they both report seeing a luminous object that disappears into a cloud.
Wow. That's fascinating to see these. And,
yep.
So what's the difference with this one? Wing Operation Center instruction.
So this one was contained in the release as well. This is a UFO report form that's specific to CFB Bagotville. That's the Air Force base I mentioned in Quebec. That's one of the main stations for our F-18 fighter jets. So their Wing Operation Center, like their main operation center, had a UFO report form. And most of the release contained a handful of these. Most of them are civilian, written in English and French, and they contain a fax number for Mr. Chris Rutkowski, as well as contact information for Transport Canada. So again, just showing this, I found this pretty interesting because again, it shows that there are, procedural guidelines for what to do with these reports in Canada. And they go to transportation officials and they go to Chris, our ufologist in Winnipeg.
Yeah, I'm just happy faxes are still alive. I'm one of those old school guys that just wants a fax periodically. So
it's amazing. Yeah, the fax machine is alive and well with the Canadian forces.
Fantastic. Well, what is, I could talk to you all day. And honestly, I think we should do this on a daily. We should just pull up documents and go through them together because I love that kind of stuff. So I appreciate you doing that with me. What's next for you? You working on another story? Can you talk about it? What's going on?
Yes, I'm always working on stuff. I'm always working on more than one thing.
Share all the secrets right now.
You can expect stories from me upcoming, involving what we like to call our credible witnesses, not to disparage witnesses.
Sure.
Who are, but there's that sort of class of police officers, soldiers, pilots. Expect a story from me involving an on-the-record interview with someone like that. As well as I'm digging hard to find out what Canada knows, and particularly what sort of information is being shared between Canada and the U.S. So always pulling threads. More stories are always coming, and plus I think I have about at least 80 pending access to information requests. So I more. Who knows what surprises will come in down the road. I'm always excited to find out.
That's what I love to hear. 80, you said 80?
I made a list for you because I know you like this kind of stuff.
Yeah, let's start from number one. We'll go down.
No, I've since in the past year, I filed 133. I've received results for 41, nil responses for 47. There's at least 40, there's 88 completed, 45 still in progress.
That's awesome.
There's still stuff coming. And
yeah.
I hope some of it's good because some of those are pretty specific requests.
Double those numbers by Monday, and we'll be in good shape. No,
I
honestly
can't keep up to you, sir. I don't think anyone can keep. You're a FOIA machine.
Well, I appreciate that, but hey, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk about this. Congratulations again on the article. For those that are watching the YouTube channel, just check down below. I've got everything linked. Daniel, what is the best way you like people to reach out to you? I know you got your Twitter handle there, which is DSOTIS. That the best way? Any website that you'd like to throw out there?
You can find me on Twitter at DSOtis. I'm pretty active on there. And often, if let's say I get some additional documents that come in on a story I've already written about, and I'm not going to write a new article, Twitter's where they end up. I'm always sharing what I have. I think people should be transparent with data. Governments have been hiding so much from us for so long. Let's not hide stuff from each other, right? So find me on Twitter at DSOtis. My personal website is danielotis.ca. That's danielotis.ca. Contact information's there if anyone wants to reach out. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Anytime, you're welcome back. Anytime, if you get anything you want to share it, please feel free to let me know. But thank you again for taking the time.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
And thank you all for listening and watching. If you are listening to the audio podcast version, just know that I broadcast most of these, if not all of these interviews, in a video format on the YouTube channel. To get there, go to www.theblackvault.com/live. That will bounce you to the channel. Subscribe, see this interview, see all sorts. And please, if you could, YouTube watchers, hit the thumbs up. Audio watchers, I aim for 5-star reviews, so please help me out by giving an honest review on any podcast platform. This show is listed under the Black Vault Radio. Thank you again, Daniel. Thank you all for listening and watching. This is John Greenwald Jr. signing off, and we'll see you next time.